My name is Yuichiro Tanaka, the president of Japan Student Group in Japan American Society. Today, I would like to conduct an interview with President Yang at University of Washington as a story of my life.
I had a very happy childhood, but it was surprisingly unregulated. My father ran a supermarket way up in the small lumber and cattle town up in Northern California, and the schools were not very good. So I would live there during the summer, worked in my father's supermarket up until I went away to law school. But in the winter, I'd go out to Utah, live with my grandparents, where I went to junior high and high school. And they had raised 8 children and were a little bit older, so they largely gave me free run to do pretty much whatever I wanted. So it was pretty happy. There was a strong educational emphasis in my home. I remember my mother, during the time I was young, she had graduated from college some years before, but she had got 2 master's degrees while she was raising us. So there was always quite a bit of emphasis on education in my house.
Do you have any dream during your childhood?
You know, the truth of the matter is I cannot remember a time in my life when I didn't want to be a lawyer. So even from sort of the earliest ages, I can remember when people asked me, what do you want to be? I remember really wanting to be a lawyer. Even when I was 11 or 12, I was reading books by lawyers and about their life in court and things like that. And so I just had always wanted to do that. I don't know why exactly, but it just always appealed to me.
I see. So you didn't clearly remember what influenced your dream or what?
You know, I really don't. I remember I was always struck by television shows about lawyers, in particular lawyers who were getting defendants off who were not guilty, or lawyers who were somehow arranging important things. It just seemed to me that these were people who could do a lot of good, and that sounded really intriguing.
So when you get into the bar, I don't know how can I pronounce Brigham Young University, right?
Brigham Young
University. Sorry about that. Brigham Young University.
Yeah.
And why did you choose the political science and Japanese as a major? Because you want to be the lawyer. So.
Well, political science seemed like a good major to me for someone who wanted to be a lawyer. It taught you a lot about the structure of our government and how the government operated. It taught a lot about writing and persuasive skills, analytical skills, which seemed to me useful. So political science seemed like a good major, and I was basically interested in it. And Brigham Young University had at the time, still does I believe, very strong kind of comparative program. So I learned about governments and politics in Latin America and in Asia and in other parts of the world, and that really appealed to me as well. The Japanese interest actually came largely because I volunteered after my sophomore year of college to serve as a missionary for the Mormon Church, and got assigned to Japan and spent about 2.5 years in Japan, and then came back to school. And so when I came back, I had some capacity in Japanese language, and I was intrigued by the country. And so that's where the Japanese major came from.
I see. What was your impression of Japan when on your first visit?
Well, my first visit was, Japan was a pretty extraordinary country, but they all spoke Japanese, and I couldn't really understand them, so it was a little challenging. But one of the things that really intrigued me about Japan is how you had a very sophisticated, well-developed economy and country and so forth that addressed many of the same issues that we had here in America, but did it very differently. And it kind of opened my eyes to the idea that many of the things I had taken for granted in America were things we had decided to do, not things that were necessary or organic, but they were choices. And why we made those choices and Japan made other choices really intrigued me. So I found it just a fascinating comparison of the two countries.
I see. So how did you spend your college life except the studying?
Well, I probably spent way too many days on the ski slopes.
Your hobby.
I paid for college in part by being a ski instructor, and so I spent a lot of days on the ski slopes, which I probably should not necessarily have done, but I remember it fondly, and I had a great time doing it. And then I have a lot of friends. Brigham Young University is sort of right near a number of different mountain ranges, and did a lot of hiking in the mountains and a lot of skiing and other sorts of things. So a lot of outdoor recreation.
Do you have any advice for the current student in UW?
Well, study harder than I did. That's my first piece of advice. But no, I give students the same advice here that I think was really important for me, which is explore. You know, you have some things you know you want to do, and pursue those. Pursue things, but also explore some things that you might not have expected that you would like, and you may not like them, but you may find a lot of ideas, a lot of passions, a lot of interests being open to you by taking courses that you wouldn't really have anticipated. I saw a real firsthand example of that. My wife went to college quite a bit later in life. She didn't start till she was 36, and the very last course she took, she studied psychology and social development and neurobiology and so forth. But the very last course she took was simply to get enough credits to graduate. It was a class on the Antarctic. And I think it was the most interesting class she said she'd ever had. In fact, I found it really interesting. We read her homework together every night. It was fascinating. So you just never know where those passions are going to come from and what's really going to educate you and inform you and who you really are at this age. And it's wonderful to explore, I think.
So what you thought you'd be doing after graduation?
Well, after graduation from college, I was sure I would go to law school. I had always wanted to do that, and so I was sure and really didn't have much doubt. So I really planned most of my trajectory through college to get into law school.
Why did you choose Harvard University?
You know, there are a couple of reasons. One was I had lived largely in the West, and I thought it would be interesting to see what the East was like. And get a little experience in a kind of different part of the country. Secondly, Harvard actually had at the time one of the very few East Asian legal studies programs. And I didn't know for sure if I wanted to pursue that, but I thought having at least the option to pursue that would be a good idea. And so it was intriguing. And so I think that's largely why I picked Harvard.
And after graduating from the Harvard University, why didn't you become a lawyer instead of becoming a professor?
Well, the principal reason was I spent 2 years clerking on different courts, serving as a kind of an assistant to a judge. And the second year was on the United States Supreme Court. I served as an assistant to Chief Justice William Rehnquist. And as I was doing that, a number of schools kind of approached me about teaching, and I had never really ever contemplated that. But what interested me about it as they talked about it was allowed me to reflect back on what I'd really found interesting about the law at the end of the day. And it was not so much the technical legal rules, although they were interesting, and learning how to manipulate those rules and understand them and apply them was interesting. But what was really interesting to me was to kind of drill down on what is the relationship between the legal rules and structures on the one hand and society on the other. In other words, what kinds of attitudes that people bring to the legal system when it's being engaged in their life. How does that affect the way the rules operate or the way the institutions operate? conversely, the way those institutions and rules are set up, how do they change people's behavior? That kind of relationship between law and society was really interesting the more I thought about it, and the comparative perspective, to compare how that works out in Japan as compared to the United States, struck me as particularly interesting. I mean, when you think about Japan, Japan is a perfect laboratory to think about that, because for 250 years it was largely closed off to the rest of the world, so it developed a very sophisticated indigenous legal system all through the Tokugawa period. Then in 1858 Japan opens up, and within a matter of 20 years, 25 maybe, they have imposed an entirely different legal system, largely derived from the Germans and the Swiss and the French. And so they take this legal system and impose it on society. And so you have a pre-existing attitudes, patterns of behavior, views about what role the law plays in your life, and you impose on that an entirely foreign set of institutions and rules. And so how do those attitudes shape the way those rules and institutions develop? Do they develop different from Germany, different from France, different from Switzerland? And conversely, how do those institutions and rules shape the way people behave? So do people in the Meiji era and subsequent eras behave differently with respect to the legal system than the people in the Tokugawa era? And it just struck me as that was just going to be a fascinating thing to think about, and would teach me a lot about legal reform and how you best structure a legal system to accomplish the ends that you want to accomplish. And so from that point, I thought, teaching could really be quite interesting. Columbia also offered me a chance to kind of develop a more elaborate Japanese legal studies program, and I had, a little bit of sense that relations between Japan and the United States were so important, but there were not many programs that trained the professionals who were largely the arbiters of that relationship. And in American society, that's very often the lawyers. So a program that helped people better understand Japan at this professional level, it seemed to me it might also be useful.
You also focusing on the Korea, right?
That's right. And that was largely because, for two reasons. One was, it again was an interesting counterpoint to Japan, because again it had its own legal system, and then the Japanese came in and really imposed the Japanese legal system on the Koreans. So you have another example of a foreign legal system being grafted onto a country, and you could then compare how does that legal system operate in Japan and how does it operate in Korea. While the institutions and the rules are virtually identical, the societies are very different, the histories are very different, the economies are very different. So do the rules and institutions change, or do the institutions change the way people behave? And so Korea was a good example. And secondly, at about the same time I was beginning to develop the Japanese program, it was clear that Korea also was becoming a very important country to the United States and indeed to the world in terms of global trade. So, and we had a lot of Korean-speaking students in Columbia, so the idea of giving them some assistance, again, at the professional level, seemed like a good thing, a useful thing to do.
So, you spent a couple of years at the Columbia University as a professor.
About 20, actually.
20.
More than a couple, but about 20.
And at the almost same time, you are the member of U.S. Commission on International Religious Freedom.
Well, the timeline's just a little different. Yeah, while I was at Columbia, I took a leave of absence and served for 4 years in the U.S. Department of State under the presidency of the first President Bush, when James Baker was the Secretary of State. And while I was there, did a lot of international negotiations. I was the lead lawyer for the U.S. delegation that negotiated German unification, for example. Also did a lot of trade negotiations. It was the time we were negotiating the Uruguay round and the NAFTA. And then I did some human rights negotiations, some international environmental law negotiations as well. When I got back to Columbia, I was approached by some colleagues at Columbia to think about starting a program that was really designed to look at international law and human rights, particularly focusing on freedom of thought, conscience, and belief. That's a space that has a lot of people participating, but come at it from very different angles. The human rights community largely comes at it from kind of a secular perspective. There's a very large sectarian community that supports freedom of religion. Could we bring those two communities together and think about the importance of that right? And so we got a very large grant and started a program. We brought a lot of interns in from foreign governments and from foreign countries who dealt with that issue. We had a big training program. We ran conferences and so forth. So when I left Columbia in 1998, I became dean at the George Washington University Law School. At exactly that time, Congress had passed what was called the International Religious Freedom Act, which created the U.S. Commission on Religious Freedom, which was designed, you had 3 people appointed by the President, 3 appointed by the Senate, and 3 appointed by the House of Representatives. And we were, the legislative mandate was to serve as an advisor to the President, to the State Department, and to Congress about how we could advance human rights through our foreign policy, but particularly in the area of freedom of thought, conscience, and belief. And so I actually was one of the first 2 appointees to that commission, and we helped set it up, and then I chaired it off and on for about the next 8 years.
And you are appointed as the president of Utah after that.
That's right.
And how did you feel when you became the president of the university?
Well, it was very different. Running a law school, even as big as George Washington University is, it's one of the bigger law schools. It's a very small part of a major university. And so to move from something where we had a $40 or $50 million budget to something that had a $3 billion budget, that had 14 different schools, including a very large medical complex, was quite a challenge. But I was really fortunate in that it was both a good university, but lots of very, very good people in senior leadership positions. And so it turned out to be an extraordinary learning experience, and I think we accomplished some things while we were there.
Have you ever imagined that you became the president of the university?
No, well, I never intended to become an academic. So, and even when I became an academic, becoming a university president was the furthest thing from my mind. In fact, I had a colleague in law school. I remember asking him one time what he really wanted to do with his life, and he said he wanted to be a university president. And I thought that was the strangest goal that I'd ever heard of. Who wanted to be a university president? He apparently did and never became one, and I didn't, or at least I never thought about it, and I did. But no, believe me, this was not in the career plan. So I suppose is another small piece of advice, which is I have loved my career, but a big part of it has been just taking advantage of opportunities as they arise, evaluating how do I do good in the world? What can I do that really might make a difference? And then sometimes it takes you in very different directions than you might anticipate, but that's okay.
I see. So after spending several years at the University of Utah, you transferred from the Utah to the University of Washington. So why did you move from that university to University of Washington?
Well, you know, a lot of people have asked me that question because I came here during the worst economic downturn the university had ever suffered. We had a 52% cut in our state funding for the university. And everybody said, you know, things are going really well for you in Utah. We built 2 million square feet of space. We moved the university up in the rankings. We're doing a lot of things. They said, why would you possibly leave? And the answer is, it's a superb university. I mean, it's one of the best in the world. You look at these international rankings, and it's consistently ranked the 14th or 15th or 16th best university in the world, not just in the United States, but in the entire world. And it deserves that reputation. But more importantly, from my perspective, I think we're undergoing a lot of change and transformation in higher education. The demographics of our student body are different. The way students have learned and grown up in the past decades very different than prior generations. The technology is changing the kind of research we can do. It's changing the way students learn. Our funding streams have changed really different, in very different and profound ways. So just lots of changes occurring in higher education. And yet I think the great public universities are one of America's absolute critical assets. In many ways, you can trace a great deal of the success of America to the great public universities. And so, as these transformations are occurring, in my judgment, it's very important we get it right. And I think there's no better university in the country positioned to do that. We have it's a superb university with a faculty that is innovative and imaginative and willing to take risks, which is really going to be essential going forward. It's world-class in areas that are critical to the future as we think about it, everything from genetic medicine to big data to computer science to human-computer interface to sustainability. I mean, the list goes on and on, but we are among the very handful of great universities in the world in all these areas that are absolutely critical. Personalized medicine, and so forth. And we're more nimble than a lot of universities, capable of working across disciplines, willing to kind of experiment and try new things, work in ways that bring together people from a number of different areas to focus on one problem or a grand global challenge of some sort. So I think, and we're cited in one of the most interesting, innovative, imaginative business communities in the world. And as I think about that constellation of attributes, I think we have a better chance of getting it right here at the University of Washington maybe than anywhere else in the country. It's not inevitable we will, but I really do think we have a chance, a better chance here than anywhere. And I thought, I'd love to be part of that. And it was really that moved me here.
How do you regard the job of president in university?
How do I regard the job of president? It's in some ways simpler than people think. It's not always easy to do, but the description isn't that hard. I believe you make sure that you have terrific people in the right places. You work through a lot of input, developing kind of a shared vision and shared direction, and then you turn people loose. You create an environment in which they can really realize their best aspirations. And you stand back and throw resources at them and let them do it. And then you give them the credit because they're the ones who really deserve it. And that's I really think what my job is.
Thank you. So, what do you want to do as the president of the University of Washington from now?
Well, I want to get higher education right. I think that's the critical variable. I think there are a lot of things we want to do. I think we want to expand our globalization efforts, and I've got some different ideas maybe than some universities do. I think a lot of universities are kind of going abroad to do that. I think part of the answer is to bring the world to us. I think I think enhancing the undergraduate experience with particular attention to the role that technology can play to make it much more effective and deep, and ensuring that we organize ourselves in ways that allow us to think a little bit less about discipline, a little bit less about I'm chemistry, I'm physics, I'm biology, I'm business, I'm law, and more about how do we develop the understanding and the skills to really apply what we know and learn to the great challenges that the world faces right now. And I think we're doing a lot of interesting things. There's a lot of good programs around the university going on doing that from which we can learn and expand and deepen that a lot, I think.
So, the two questions left from me. And what is your current goal in your career of your life?
Well, I hope the rest of my career is here. I'm sort of in a position where I can't really quite conceive any other job in the world that would be nearly as interesting or fun as this one. And you never say never, but I really do. I do fully anticipate that this will occupy me for much of my remaining work days.
Yeah. Do you have? Would you mind if you give me a message or advice to the future generation, like students or young professionals, as they formulate their life story of their life?
Well, I would warmly encourage everybody to really explore. When you're young, it gives you a chance to really find out who you are and what you want to do, where your passions are, and I would do that. The other thing I would think about is, as you're going through education, I would think less about a major and more about, or even within the context of a major, more about developing the skills that you really want to use throughout life. Capacities for lifelong learning, real capacity to develop serious analytical and critical thinking skills, capacity to communicate, writing and speaking, capacity to work with groups coming at a problem from very different perspectives and finding ways to understand those perspectives and apply them to the problem at hand, things like that. And you can do it within a major, saying, this class is likely to kind of help me do this better, and this is likely to help me do this better. And that's the way to structure, a curriculum in college, but it's also the way to think about work. As you're thinking about a job, okay, that's going to allow me to develop these kinds of skills, and then I can move either within the company or to another place and develop companion skills that really will fit me to do what I really want to do in the world and somehow to make it a better place.
Thank you so much.
My pleasure.
Do you have any question?
I have one. So you mentioned to kind of have students explore more than to focus on their majors. Like for me, sometimes I feel like I'm lost in what I want to see. Like I would imagine a path that I'd want to proceed in, and then on the process I lose myself. What's the best way out, do you think?
Well, I don't think you should view being a little bit lost as necessarily a bad thing, because it suggests that you took a risk, it suggests that you got into something, and it suggests that you're kind of finding your way. That's not a bad thing. I would suggest when you get into it and decide, this really isn't for me, I'd cut your losses and try something else. That there's nothing wrong with kind of changing chapters. Nothing wrong with saying, that was interesting. I tried that. Didn't really, didn't light me up. Didn't excite me. I didn't feel like I was progressing and learning and developing the way I really wanted to. So I'm going to take a different turn. And there's nothing wrong with that. I would not view dead ends or getting lost, in something as necessarily a bad thing. If you're only going to do things that take you in a very straight path and there's no losses and no dead ends, you're not exploring very much. I do a lot of hiking, and I count the number of times, I can't count the number of times that I backtracked to get back on a path because the path I took, while interesting and so forth, wasn't in the end going to take me where I wanted to go. But I learned a lot on the way, saw some beautiful things, and enjoyed it. So I wouldn't be critical of yourself for doing that. I really wouldn't. Once you've decided this is not the right path, if you stay on it for any of a number of reasons, your parents are telling you to stay on it, or you feel like, gee, I'm this far down, so if I back up, I'll lose all that effort, then you've got a problem. Remember the notion of sunk costs. Economists always tell you to remember the notion of sunk cost, that once you paid for something, it's paid for. And I mean, like, it's like going to a bad movie, you know? If the movie's bad, walk out, because you've already paid, and you can either waste 2 more hours of your time watching the rest of the bad movie and still have paid, or you can walk out and do something else that's fun for 2 hours and still have paid. In either case, you paid and move on. So I wouldn't really be critical of being lost. I wouldn't beat yourself up for it. I wouldn't think it's a bad thing necessarily. It only gets bad when you realize it's not where you want to be, not what you want to do, and you don't do something about that. Then do something about it. But I wouldn't be particularly critical at this age about about wandering some.
Thank you.
Thank you so much for having interview.
My pleasure. Thank you.